immanence to our world, built with the resources of the model M. And it is precisely this technique of forcing that grounds the existence of events, or what is not being qua being. These events are not miracles, for unlike miracles, they are not coming from the outside. They are not transcendent, but they appear as exceptions in our world. They are immanent. So, in a way, the immanency versus transcendency is precisely what makes the difference between an event and a miracle. A miracle, from its very definition, would be, a sort of transcendence coming into the world, while events are immanent. So that's the very difference opposing these two terms. Now, after describing in a way the Badiou's negativity, or to what Badiou's thought is opposed, let me now move to the affirmative aspect of his thinking, namely to the recent book, The Immanence of Truth. So, as I already said, the constructible equals largely what Badiou understands by finitude. And in the Immanence of Truth, we can find five so-called operators of the finitude: identity, repetition, evil, necessity or God, and death. Finitude acts through the so-called recouvrement, or covering, by making constructible something which on the first glance acts as a true non-constructible infinite. To these different kinds of constructible finitude, Badiou opposes four different forms of the infinite. These different infinities are organized into an ascendant hierarchy, i.e. we are moving from the smallest form of infinity to the largest one, and we have to keep in mind that in this hierarchy, when you move to a larger form of infinity, the larger form of infinity always finitizes the previous one in a way. So first there is a so-called inaccessible infinity, or infinity via transcendence. Here the infinite is understood as simply what is beyond the finite, or what is not finite. This form of infinity is negative, and there's no way to understand this infinity without the context of the finite. The infinity by transcendence resembles to the figure of God in negative theology. We can also compare it, as I said, to the bad Hegelian infinite. Second, there is the infinity defined by its indivisibility. This infinity is defined by the fact that it cannot be divided, and division is, as we know, is the most elementary tactic of any oppression. Thus, this form of infinity is defined by the fact that even if we try to divide it, there will always be some homogeneous part which resists this division and has the same cardinality as the initial undivided infinite. Third, there is the infinity of big parts, and this infinity is simply defined by the fact that it contains many large parts. Well, this might sound very simple, but the technical mathematical explanation of this concept is relatively complex, and it takes the shape of a so-called non-principal ultrafilter kappa complete, which, is very frightening term. But I'll not go into detail here. In fact, the complexity of this part of the book consists in explaining what does it mean that something is big or small, or what does it mean that something is big in itself, because we know that big or small are only relational categories, and obviously something is bigger when it is bigger than something else, so how do we do it to say that something is big in itself? Finally, the fourth infinity is the infinity defined by its proximity to the absolute. With this fourth infinity, we are now really in the theoretical core of the book, for it is this infinity that brings into play Spinoza's notion of the attributes of the absolute. So I have already mentioned the absolute class V, which is the place of all thinkable forms of multiplicity. It is a place from which all mathematical concepts are somehow subtracted. Now the infinity, which is close to the absolute, will be a class that expresses, although obviously it is much smaller, this absolute class V the place of all thinkable forms of multiplicities. In other words, it will be a class which is somehow isomorphic to V. The V is embedded in this class, a little bit like as if we imagine a great architecture edifice embedded in its concrete foundations. For instance, when we build a house, we need to first make excavations, we need to fix the foundations, then we embed the steel trusses in this base. That means the house exceeds the foundations, but these foundations are really necessary so that actually the house does not fall. They are somehow isomorphic to the house. In Plato's vocabulary, we could say that this fourth kind of infinity participates on the absolute class V. If V is equivalent to Spinoza's notion of the substance, this fourth infinity then equals Spinoza's concept of the attributes of the absolute. The absolute expresses itself through its attributes, but nevertheless remains separated from them. In ethics, Spinoza defines the substance as, I quote, what is in itself and is conceived through itself, and, unquote, whose concept does not require the concept of another thing from which it must be formed. This substance, which according to Spinoza equals God, is eternal, infinite, and indivisible. So again, the word substance, substances versus one substance. Leibniz multiple substances is monos versus Spinoza's one indivisible substance. In other words, for Spinoza, God is equivalent to what Badiou names the place of all thinkable forms of the multiple. However, since we as human beings cannot apprehend by our reason all the substance, we can access the substance only via its attributes. And each of these attributes expresses one essence, one aspect of this infinitely infinite substance. Thus, Spinoza defines these attributes as, I quote, what the intellect perceives of a substance as constituting its essence. He says that the substance is composed of infinity of these attributes, of what Badiou would call classes similar to V. But in his philosophical interrogation, Spinoza somehow struggles to give us examples of these attributes. In fact, he ends up admitting that we human beings, we know only two attributes, thought and extension, and it is not really clear why do we know just these two attributes, and if we could indeed know a third one, even though we don't know it. So the structure of the notion of the attribute of the absolute is thus very similar to Badiou's classes that are similar to V. And these classes similar to V are, in my mind, just another definition of Badiou's category of truth. For Badiou, truth, that means the actual recollections of infinite truth procedures, are the attributes of the absolute, and not the thought and extension as Spinoza would say. Now the possibility to weaponize Spinoza against Leibniz depends on which reading of this notion do we choose. There has been a common understanding of Spinoza according to which these attributes were in fact mere ways of perceiving the substance. This interpretation of Spinoza's attributes was posited, for instance, by Hegel. On the other hand, Badiou seems to follow an understanding of the attributes of the absolute that is neither correlationist nor nominalist, but is realist. He seems to follow, in many aspects, the interpretation of Spinoza proposed by Martial Guéroul in his famous 1968 monumental study of Spinoza, who defended the idea that the attributes are real beings constituting the substance. For Guéroul, the attributes were the ontological principles of the substance, for they constitute its reality and they enable the identification of the substance. In other words, the attributes are not the different names of the substance, they are real beings within the substance. Badiou clarified his understanding of the attributes of the absolute during a 2017 lecture on Spinoza at the Paris 8 University, when he mentioned that the attributes are, according to him, I quote, ontological correlations interior to the substance and not our perspectives or our points of view on the substance. End of quote. Thus, it is by positing this realist reading of Spinoza that Badiou is able to somehow turn Spinoza against Leibniz, to find in Spinoza resources to think an actual non-denumerable infinity or infinities, and to combat any tentative to reduce our thinking to the constructible. Thus, this realist reading of Spinoza enables Badiou to affirm that philosophy is more than a language game, and any thinking for the 21st century must free itself from its capture by the linguistic turn which has defined the previous century. Badiou's ethical imperative incites us to become subjects, and we can become subjects only by embracing the generic infinity in us, by becoming eternal, sometimes, as the title of the book presented today would say. Beyond the finitude, Badiou incites us to choose the infinite. And to choose the infinite in our finite existence should be precisely the light orienting one's life in our obscure times. Thank you. So I can accept very few questions, and then we give word to Alain. Yeah?
So in which sense is it not only a weaponization of Spinoza against Leibniz, but also a weaponization of mathematics as such against its discourse within the outskirts of state power, politics, and more? Because the way mathematics is used sort of as an economic tool, right, has nothing to do with the way in which Leibniz or Spinoza spoke about mathematics, and in some ways it ties it to the déchet, but I'm not sure about that relation either.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's a weaponization of, let's say, the realist interpretation of what is a number. And obviously, when we speak about realist interpretation, it's a realist interpretation by Alain, because, for instance, I think it's, I'm not sure, it's in the book, the Transit on the Transitory Ontology, where, for instance, Badiou you mentioned this book on the philosophy of mathematics, which is a collection put together by, I think Russell, and he mentions that, saying that okay, the kind of realist what they think is the realist interpretation, this is not really the realist according to Plato. So obviously this is Badiou's realism, but in a way, what he tries to do is to say that in mathematics it's like the numbers are like the names of the void or the indiscernible, so mathematics is somehow sutured to the void. So for instance, if you think of the traditional discussion in the philosophy of mathematics, for instance, what is the status of mathematical objects, whether objects are mere like creations of the mind, or it's the expressions of language or whatever. So for Badiou, in a way, he would say, well, there are no objects in mathematics. And when we accept this non-objective or non-objectual notion of mathematics, then we maybe get to something to saying that, okay, mathematics actually is related to the real, because in the real there are no objects neither. In this way, yes, I think there's some weaponization of this particular reading of understanding of mathematics against the idea that it would be the language that is important, and that only even the mathematics is just an expression of language and so on. So there is a search for something like I would say a search for a real through which is behind the number. I'm not sure.
So do you consider that real is opposite to the idea of the opinion? So the idea behind the number is to fight the opinion. So the non-democracy of the real is the idea behind the number.
I don't know if obviously the real of our world in some way is composed of opinions, The real of our world would be the the capitalism itself, which is grounded in opinions. But I think what we find in this kind of thinking is the precise idea that actually we can find something which is more, than the opinions, which is the idea, and it's very like kind of in Plato's understanding of the term, where we have something that participates, on the absolute. So the idea is being that participation on the absolute. Anyone would like to add something?
I mean, definitely, the question of mathematical realism or Platonism is one of the things which is coming more and more on the agenda of mathematics today, especially in view of what has been mentioned previously, two conceptions of the V, either potential or actual or unique universe of the real, or several possibilities of the real. So again, I think this is, it's not only between language and something which is not language, within realism there could be also, because there are, for instance, multiverses could be still realist and Platonist. So how do you situate this within this divide between language and non-language?
Hello.
No, just on one point, a part of the necessity of mathematics in contemporary philosophy comes from the fact that during a long time the infinite has been in fact a religious concept. And so it's across the revolution of Cantor that the infinite becomes in fact a true scientific concept. And naturally, before this moment, the infinite was a very important category in philosophy, but practically always in the context of classical metaphysics, where you have practically always God and a proof of the existence of God, which was a classical exercise of classical philosophy to give a proof of the existence of God. So, as you know, the first proof of the existence of God we can find in Aristotle. It's the inventor of metaphysics. And so, at the end of the 19th century, mathematics proposed, in my opinion, a sort of philosophical revolution, which is to propose the concept of the infinite, which is not of theological nature. It's a laicization of the infinite. And it is why it's difficult to escape the question of mathematics if you have in the idea that the infinite must be a fundamental concept in the field of philosophy. If you accept absolutely finitude, if you stay in the constructive universe, it's different. So maybe the opposition between mathematical philosophy and non-mathematical philosophy is largely today the opposition concerning the use or the not use of infinite as a philosophical category. And not only cosmological or something like that.
Yeah?
I had a question about the relationship between constructible and non-constructible sets, and also the relationship between an event and how it lies outside being qua being, and how the event as being a rupture within being qua being is like, what is then the relation of the event to V?
Quel est le lien entre l'événement et le V? Quel est le lien, par exemple, entre quand on regarde l'événement et l'être, comme bien constructible,
J'ai compris, mais give the answer.
Maybe just to rephrase in other words.
Yeah, no, I think if for instance, if you look at V, my sketch, and this is the very schematic sketch that I gave in the paper, which is in this book, is that okay, you have the V, which is like this kind of triangle standing on its top. Then in the V you have one class which is isomorphic to V, in which the V is embedded, and so I think in a way the event is like from what this kind of particular class, which is the attribute of the absolute, is in originating somehow. So we can draw it in a way as the event like being at the origin of this infinite procedure. So at least my way of understanding this is that the attributes of the absolute are like truths, because if you look at the being an event, in being an event, Badiou talks not of truths are like the names in the future anterior. Truths are the actual infinity in a way, because it's the sort of like a hypothetical recollection of all the points which are made by an infinite truth procedure. So what we obviously experience in our lives are only truth procedures, but we somehow call them truths, which is really like calling an actual infinity. And the event is precisely this kind of point of contingency that in a way somehow stands outside the absolute class V. It stands outside the ontology in which this very like in which this kind of class in which the V is embedded originates. So I would say the event, that is my understanding, would be that the event is somehow exterior to this class V,
Well,
but the class, obviously, the class, like the truth itself, the attribute is inside V, but originates. It's something that exceeds the V itself,
Yeah, because in a world in the constructible universe, or
Yeah.
the set of constructible sets, there's no possibility for
Yeah.
anything. And something that strikes what you're saying is that in meditation 18, in being an event 1, rather belonging of the signifier of the event to its signification.
Yeah.
So in the sense that you can't map an event to already existing predicate. It can't be corresponded. In fact, the event sort of creates its own ground for its signification. But so my question is, I mean, to put it simply, and I think you explained it well in terms of the way that V and the class in which it is embedded in, where truth procedures and attributes can be actualized, is somehow not reducible to sort of the set of statements that you could make about something that would be beyond being plugged in. So I guess my question is, where does the event come from? Would be a way to ask that question.
Yeah, well,
That's basically the question.
That's a question, because I think what he's trying to say, okay, there's this V, and then there's like a sphere of total contingency,
Right.
from which the event comes,
Right.
There is a technical definition of an event, because an event is a multiplicity, but without one axiom of the theory of multiplicity, the axiom of foundation. So is something like a multiplicity without foundation. That is multiplicity which is in happening and not in foundation of the set. And so we can say that is something like an erratic multiplicity, because it is not founded in the place where it happens. And so technically, it's the axiom of foundation, which is a great axiom of multiplicity properly, which is in some sense suppressed by an event. So, an event without foundation. She learned something. But it's explained.
Yeah, no, I think the way, like, it's really like, it's like this notion of the cleaner man
Yeah.
at the end, you know?
In some sense,
In
yes.
some sense.
It's near kill.
It's like-
It's near cleaner man.
Yeah.
But that's precisely what gives us a trace of the infinite, because it's that which cannot be sort of made sense of within the constructible universe,
Yeah,
and that sort of gives an opening to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like a negativity of that.
We can say that it's something like an immanent rupture with the legality of immanence itself. That to be in the situation is to be conformed to the totality of the axiom of multiplicity. If you have one axiom which is not here, in some sense it's a rupture of the legality of presence in totality.
Okay, maybe one more and then we pass to Alain.
A slightly technical question, but you made the claim constructivism equals finitude.
Yeah.
I'm inclined to disagree. You know, mathematics is not ontology, but
Il n'y a pas d'accord que le constructivisme et finitude. Mathématiques c'est différent.
but the inconsistency proof of Gödel is in a sense precisely a proof of infinity. A small infinity, but
Le théorème de Gödel est une preuve d'une infini.
so maybe an example would be the isomorphism with the Turing's halting problem.
Avec le problème de Turing. Ça, c'est bien.
So, because it just keeps going, you can't tell it will halt, and you can't make just another Turing machine to calculate when the other one will stop.
Tu ne peux pas faire un autre fonction de Turing.
So, to me, this opens up a philosophical question related to the field of computer science.
Entre la philosophie et la computer science. Science de computer science.
Ordinateur. About bridging constructivist infinities towards generic infinities.
Est-ce que l'informatique peut créer un pont entre les infinis constructibles et le générique?
The difference is not between constructibility and genericity. The difference is between constructibility and non-constructibility. And the question of generic is another problem. So we can have a clear idea of what is the possibility of a non-constructible set. The possibility of a non-constructible set is associated with the precise existence of a form of infinity, the name of which is zero sharp. Okay. If we assume the existence of zero sharp, you have, by necessity, some multiplicity which are not constructible, and multiplicity which are not constructible cannot happen in the context of constructibility, even constructibility by machines. So we have certainly something which is inaccessible to the calculation of machines if the zero sharp exists. That is the point. So zero sharps, the existence of zero sharps is a sort of limit of the calculation in the sense of constructibility. After that, you can refuse to the existence of zero charge. It's a point of axiomatization. But in this case, the freedom of truth is limited, because all the new forms of infinity which are beyond the constructibility cannot be constructed. That is the point. So it's as very often in philosophy, at this point we have a choice. We have a choice. Because we cannot prove that zero sharp exists. Cannot prove. Maybe all the universe is constructible. Maybe. For me, it's less interesting. At the end, it's an aesthetic choice. There is aesthetic choice in philosophy too. You prefer some orientation to the other, and I think that to explain completely the story of invention, creation, something with universal value and so on, it's more easy to be on the side of the existence of the non-constructible than to be on the side of constructibility, or pure constructibility. And pure constructibility is certainly the possibility to substitute some machines to humanity as such, which is the future without any interest, in fact. And that, it is the point where there is a relationship between mathematics and ethical choice. A point of constructibility.
Okay, and I think with that I would, Alain, give you the word to conclude.
No, the point is that the hierarchy of cardinality, the hierarchy of big infinite, big sort of infinite sets, is oriented by a non-existing absolute as such. There is no the big one at the end of the hierarchy. It's not like the hierarchy of angels, if you want. Between the finite and the infinite, we have all the form of angel, which was a very interesting subject for philosophy during the Middle Age. The distinction between the angel of the first level and Seraphine, the angel of the very near God. So angel was disposed between humanity and the big one as a scale. There is something like that in the hierarchy of infinite sets, but there is no final point. So there is no God. But there is something which in some sense can approximate the idea of absoluteness. Absoluteness being the proximity, not the identity, but the proximity of a non-existing absolute as such. If you define absoluteness in the framework of multiplicities, you say, by obligation, that the absolute is the totality of possible forms of multiplicity. But, we have spoken of that before, we can demonstrate that the totality of all forms of multiplicities cannot be a multiplicity itself. So, in some sense, that sort of absolute does not exist. Does not exist in the rational form of being. if you are not a multiplicity, we have no being. If all being is multiplicity. So finally, you arrive at a point of negative existence of something. But we have the hierarchy of the infinite, which is in the direction of the absolute, without final point. And so, finally, the key concept is the concept of elementary function between the non-existing absolute and a subclass of itself which exists and is Spinozist theory of the attributes of the absolute. Alors, you can say, okay, but finally, what exists really in all that? So the absolute does not exist, the hierarchy exists, but what is the signification of the proximity between the hierarchy and the non-existing absolute? That is the point. And about this point, we have a recent mathematical activity, which is really remarkable, tout à fait extraordinary. Now, I attempted to describe, not to give the proof, but to describe on this point a fundamental mathematical theorem. Il n'y a pas de tableau. Represents the hierarchy of the infinite. From the first, which is the natural numbers, the name of which is omega, and after that, a hierarchy of infinity, more and more infinite, and the absolute non-existing at the top. So you have something without any end, because the end is a fictive one. It can be defined, not exist. And we can define inside the non-existing totality of all possible forms of multiplicity, we can define a subset of that sort of thing, the name of which is a class. For example, the class of all ordinals is a class which is inside the class of all possible forms of multiplicity. And here we have a fundamental theorem, which is otherwise it's difficult to explain in ordinary language, but it's my attempt. So, really the picture of the situation. We have something at the top which is non-existing, but we can say something of this non-existing. We can say that is the supposed totality of all possible forms of multiplicity. And you have a hierarchy of infinite which are more and more gigantesque, enormous. So, more enormous they are, more proxime of the non-existing absolute. It's clear. And we can demonstrate that if exists between the non-existing absolute and a subclass of the non-existent absolute, so a special category of multiplicity, which is a big subset of the non-existing set of all forms of multiplicity, if exists something like that. So it exists really a subclass of the absolute. And if we can define between the non-existing absolute and the subclass, we have the definition. a sort of projective relation, point by point. You can define something like that. That is elementary function in French, plongement élémentaire. L'idée de the non-existing absolute is plunge in the class inside A in a rational manner. If something like that can be defined, exists really a very big infinite, which is like a testimony of all that. So we have non-existence, ensuite definition, which is a relationship between the non-existent and something inside the non-existent. And if you have all that, which is in some sense of imaginary nature, because it does not exist, you can prove that exists really a new form of infinity in the hierarchy itself. And so we have the equivalence between the existence of an attribute of the non-existing totality on one side, and the true existence of a multiplicity, special, a set, which is a very, very enormous set. Minimally a set measurable or complete. So, when we have something like that, we introduce, finally, an ascendant movement of thinking in the direction of the absolute, and you know that you are near absolute because you have the existence, the real existence of a very big absolute set which exists. And finally, the construction of the absoluteness of truth takes place in this montage, in this relationship. And yet there exist three big parts, three movements, if you want. First, general description of all that, more precise than my image today. Multiplicities, axiomatic of the absolute, non-existing absolute, all form of multiplicities, theory of the infinite, theory of finitude, Constructible, Colville, and so on, and that's the descriptive part. Second, the construction of the concept of the attribute of the absolute. And inside the definition of the attribute of the absolute, the proof that we can have something like that by existing, by the testimony of the existing of a very big set. Alors the hierarchy continues, and so to find the new names becomes complex. Where we have enormous, super enormous, you have transcendent, you have so on. Because we are practically an infinity of ascendant infinite. And so it's a sort of we have no sufficient names to name all that. And after that, the book returns to truth procedure, real, with example concerning art, science, politics, and law, in the context of their specific form of infinity. just after that, what is the central difficulty? I think central difficulty is concentrated in two big theorems, which are difficult to understand. The théorème de Scott, théorème de Scott et théorème de Jensen. Alors, le théorème de Scott, which is if exists a complete infinite set, it exists an attribute of the absolute. So it's the reverse of what I was saying before. If you have a testimony of the absolute, you have the infinite set. But the demonstration can be that of the reverse. If exists a complete infinite set, which is sometimes under other name, it exists an attribute of the absolute. And so we have a pure relationship between existence of some form of infinity and existence of some form of attribute of the non-existing absolute. It's the théorème de Scott. Et le théorème de Jensen, if omega sharp exists, then exist sets which cannot be reduced to finitude. So it was about the becoming of my exposition. We must admit that to understand really the demonstration to prove these two theorems is an hard exercise. The proofs are in the book. And it is why I propose at the beginning of the book to read the book without the proofs. And I give the guarantee that the proof exists. But really, it's the most interesting to read also the proof. Finally, at the end of all that, what is philosophical situation in common language? First, we have a clear theory of being, a clear ontology. This ontology is ontology of multiplicity as such, and pure multiplicity. That is multiplicity which is composed of multiplicity. So there is no primitive real, but only the form of multiplicity. Second, we have a possible definition of what is existence. Being first, for that existence. And with existence, we have the idea of what is the world. And so we understand how the truth can be universal even if it is created in a specific world. And third, we have the possibility to connect the truth to the absolute by the mediation of the hierarchy of type of infinity in the Kantorian theory. And so we have a completely modern theory of the possible absoluteness of a truth without any divine guarantee. Without any part of the demonstration of religious nature. It's my glory. if all that is true. Good. Oh, why not? Why not questions? Alain a déjà la question.
I have a question concerning the relation between the second book and the third, because in the sort of particular worlds of the second book, when working with category theory, there's this sort of natural notion of universe that's not the same as the von Neumann universe that appears in parts 1 and 3. And so my question is how those two relate, in the sense that you can't use a J embedding the way you can with the sets of the sort of the von Neumann stages V alpha, like what's done in 1 and 3, because the universe in sort of the particular world is constructed of morphisms and objects, and therefore you can't sort of construct an embedding. So I'm not sure how this plays out, in the sense that the universe within the sort of particular world doesn't seem to have an easy relation to the absolute. And I was curious your thoughts on sort of how this mathematical relation manifests in ordinary language, or lack thereof.
Alors, a point is that a world in the concept of world that I propose is always infinite. You cannot have functional of all that, something like rationality of all that, without affirming that a world is always infinite. If you take a finite world, all that now, no sense at all. And even my proposition is to say that all world is a big infinite. It is not really a big infinite. It's difficult to have effectively the result. But with a world which is at the third or fourth degrees of infinity, it's correct. And we have no problem, finally, concerning the relation to the absolute, because we have sufficient relation to the hierarchy of the infinite.
Even when constructed out of morphisms, that's that's my morphisme.
Quand c'est construit des
Topos.
morphismes,
Topos.
même quand c'est construit des morphismes dans un topos.
No, the question, when you define a topos, you must precise the universe of the topos. And we observe that the universe of the topos must be infinite, in fact. So we can have the topos of Grothendieck of a sufficient
size.
Can I ask a question about the notion of the idea, l'idée?
Oui, j'ai compris.
Parce que vous dites l'idée c'est toujours une anticipation infinie portant sur l'existence. I wanted to know what's une idée absurde for you?
Une idée absurde. But l'idée absurde porte. Enfin, je ne vais pas parler français. An idea of absurd idea is an idea of something we know that it cannot exist rationally. C'est comme ça.
In the real, you say à confirmer dans le réel. You say une idée à confirmer dans le réel. It's something that you have to confirm in the real. You think the absurd is something you can't confirm?
Oui, mais in any case, what is an absurd idea? How we define an absurd idea? if an idea is something which must be in some sense, in a world, confirmed by some point of existence in the world, the idea is absurd only during a certain time. But if it is verified in the real, it's not absurd. And in the becoming of science, you have something like that. For example, during all the story of mathematics before practically Cantor, you have the idea that an infinity an actual infinity cannot be assumed by mathematics. Only virtual infinity, but not actual. But finally, in the context of Cantor, you discover that it's absolutely possible to assume actual infinity. And so what was absurd becomes true.
Is the proximity of the top of the attributes to the non-existent absolute considered a relationship?
Est-ce que la proximité entre les attributs de l'absolu et de l'absolu lui-même est considérée quoi?
A relationship, and if it's considered a relationship.
Yes, it's a mathematical you have a mathematical definition of the relationship. It's immanent relationship between the non-existing and the class of the non-existing. You can define the relationship point by point, and it's a definition which is a definition between something which does not exist and something which exists. But you can define the relationship exactly as if you were thinking that the non-existing exists.
Right. But if it exists.
But it's only a supposition. It's not. If I'm supposing that the totality exists without changing the definition, which is all the possible form of multiplicity, all the sets. I don't change the definition, but I can define formally the relationship between this non-existing totality and an existing class, or a class which can be precisely defined. And after that, we work.
There's a certain section in the book where you talk about a lag that sometimes occurs between a mathematical theory and its physical instantiation. I think it's like conic sections in like, oh sorry.
Une sorte de vide entre théorie et mathématique, et par exemple, ça impressionne dans la physique, dans la théorie physique, par exemple, si on pense à la théorie des coniques.
La théorie des coniques, oui, bien sûr.
So like, yeah, the gap between the formalization of conic sections in ancient Greece and then Kepler's use of them in astronomy. Would you take it as a given that a mathematical formalism will eventually produce some sort of physical instantiation, or is it more of a...
quelque chose de donné, par exemple, le formalisme mathématique produit toujours une matérialisation dans la physique.
No, in fact, in physics, you have a control by experience. Without control by experience, you have no real physics. Or experience is always something in a world. And so you are operate from generalize in mathematics and experience in the world. And so physics is only the modality of presence of mathematics, that is, theory of being, appropriate to a specific world. And so physics is not only concerning being, but also concerning existence. That is the point. It's precisely the difference between mathematics and physics. In physics, we are in existing situation and not in generality of being.
À Okay, so I will take one last question.
Thank you, Professor Badiou. I really enjoy and appreciate your work. And I think your philosophical system is highly political.
Oui, oui.
And I think I'm super interested in your placing of the subject and its relation to truth and its obligation to.
Quel est le lien entre le sujet et la notion de la vérité?
But the subject is not equivalent to a human being or some just one singular actor, but it could be.
Le sujet n'est pas nécessairement équivalent à ce que c'est que l'être humain. L'être humain.
For example, in being an event,
Par
you
exemple, dans
would talk of to bring like the last section to bring the indiscernible into like to think of it in terms of undecidable and actually to decide and this agency to decide.
Par exemple, dans la dernière section de l'événement, tu parles de l'âme
Okay.
et du lien au sujet.
And I read the political balance of your work or the balance of the subject as the consequences of all kinds of decisions and choices made by the subject to make new situations.
Oui, oui.
La valeur politique de tout ça, c'est la conséquence des décisions du sujet de nouvelles situations.
But I wonder, in these new situations where truths are re-established or acknowledged,
Dans ces nouvelles situations où les vérités sont reconnues,
should there be a shared or a common world where we have a kind of standard for those truths?
est-ce que ça prédispose après la notion d'un monde commun équitable monde où on a une sorte de critère de vérité, critère de ces vérités-là?
Oui, I think that your question is the question of the possible existence of politic of truth, something like that. And in my idea, naturally, I think it's always a contradiction and a difficulty when the universality of a truth is recognized only by a minority of subjects. And this very often the situation. And so I think it's a task of political activists or philosophers or what you want. It's a sort of imperative, a task to explain and to organize the possibility of a real collective existence of a truth at the level of different categories of truth, at the level of artistic creation, at the level of science, at the level. Observe today, for example, it's a pity that science is so aristocratic. Science, it by necessity must be the knowledge of everybody. And it's not absolutely the case today. Science is a specialty, mathematics is aristocratic, absolutely, and so on. All that is negative. And so, philosophy is also in the direction to explain that truth must be, different truths, must be the interest of humanity as such. And it is why, at the end, education is a fundamental philosophical question. And it was the idea of Plato. It's not a new idea, it's absolutely the idea of Plato. Education is fundamental for transformation of the relationship between humanity and universality. And we are at the level of that sort of question, we are largely in pure animality today. who are not at the level of humanity. What humanity is able of universal creation, so humanity is able of some form of relation to the absolute, but today is the fragmentary, aristocratic, and poor. And so humanity is really not at all what she must be. Okay. We know that humanity is not at the top of its possibility.
Okay, I think we can close the day on this remarks. It was an intense day, so I thank you all for your attention and patience to, today. And there will be recordings from the session soon. So if you want to review some of the things that have been taught, we'll share the link with the recordings. And again, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who has been involved in the organization of this day. Thank you so much.
Oh no, c'est le tien. Moi, c'est le tien. Je veux bien. Non, c'est très difficile. C'est quand même
I must say, I'm personally a legalist, so everything is actually something that I study. But I'm particularly here on, and so sort of like this idea of absolute that we can't really confirm if it's existence or not, but precisely the structure of Badiou is precisely that ascendant. Of course, it takes the Ptolemaic universe, but I think of the ninth range prima moment, where all being actually experienced is absolute, because of course it rests on doesn't posit the 1 and 9, precisely of course the more and so of course it comes back into, we might say, love, but for him it's not between two individuals, it's precisely the absolute itself. So I just see some interesting
Yes.
Entre oui et l'absolu. Oui. Oui, oui. Oui. Analyse en formation, ok.
Oh, it's for sure. Hi, just wanted to introduce you. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I was wondering,